Everybody for coming. So glad that you all were able to make it out tonight. First, I want to also say thank you to all of the state reps who are participating, who went out and informed the residents about this information. I'll start with Representative Sheldon Neeley, the 34th District, representing the City of Flint. Representative Cheryl Kennedy from the 49th District. And Representative Tim Sneller in the 50th District. So just a little bit about the format tonight. We're going to have presentations from MDEQ and DHHS. Steve Sliver, who's right here, Stephanie Kammer, Al Taylor, Jim Ardwin, Paul Buckholz, and Deb McKenzie-Taylor with MDHHS. And as they're presenting, if you have questions, please write them on the cards. And if you send them down the line, there'll be a staff member who will collect them, and we're compiling all those questions so that we can ask questions to them at the end of the presentations. And also, if you also have specific questions about the Buick City site, we have some folks from the Racer Trust who are around to be able to answer those questions. Patricia Spitzley and Grant Trigger from Racer Trust. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Steve Sliver to start out the presentations.
All right, good evening everybody, and thanks for the opportunity to come and talk to you a little bit about what Michigan is doing with these PFAS compounds. And we're going to start out with just a little bit of the chemistry side of things to get us understanding a little bit more about the compounds that we're dealing with tonight. And so these PFAS, these per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, and I like the acronym a lot better than trying to pronounce it. These are chemical compounds that enjoy one of the strongest bonds in chemistry, which is both a plus and a minus, depending on whether their intended use and then how do we address them and the challenges of dealing with them in the environment. But that carbon-fluorine bond, and we'll talk about this as we go along tonight, is a really strong bond. They act as surfactants, so they like to be in between different media. They don't like water, they don't like oil. And they've been around for a while. They've been around since the first of them started to be developed back in the 1940s. And there's over 5,000 of them. We focus on just a few. And so I'm always guilty of overgeneralizing sometimes when I talk about PFAS compounds, but here are some of the acronyms of the ones that we know a little bit more about and that some of the attention has been on more than others. PFOA, that is a compound that has been used, for example, in getting Teflon coatings on pans. And the PFOS, that has been used historically in Scotchgard, for example, protections on different fabrics. Both of these have been phased out, but we probably know more about them because they've been around as long as they have. Some of these other ones up here are ones that we're learning more about, all the way to like the Gen X compounds, if you've heard about PFAS compounds in North Carolina, that those are replacement compounds for the PFOA, those Teflon type compounds. So, I've always said it's easier to talk about where PFAS compounds in chemistry aren't used than it is to list all of the ones where they are. And there's not many industries or uses of these in consumer products that there's not some impact. Even things like the Rain-X that you put on your windshield, certain compounds, chemicals, herbicides, things that enjoy surfactants to make things spread out nice and easy on surfaces, and things heat resistant, for example. And so, why are we concerned about these compounds today? Well, they're pretty much ubiquitous in society because of all of their uses, and they're persistent. Like I mentioned, that carbon-fluorine bond doesn't break down naturally. It's very hard to get rid of in the environment. And they have a tendency, some of them, to accumulate in like fish tissue and other animal tissues. And they're associated with adverse health effects. Deb McKenzie-Taylor will talk a little bit more about that from the health side. But I guess a couple other things that are really important to note is we don't have a whole lot of information on most of these compounds. There's not a lot of peer-reviewed science. We're learning every day. We're learning rapidly about the effects of these compounds, how they behave in the environment. And we don't really have a complete regulatory structure for how these materials should be managed as much as we do in other programs for other contaminants. I'd like to show this conceptual site diagram because it really illustrates the challenges we have for a compound that is as persistent and pervasive in the ecosystem as these different PFAS compounds are. Essentially what this shows is that we are cycling these compounds throughout our ecosystem. We're not effectively removing and destroying them. So for example, you know, not to pick on landfills, but as I mentioned earlier, PFAS chemistry is in a lot of consumer products. And what's the final disposition at the end of life of those products? It's a landfill. And if they leach out of those products and get in the landfill leachate, that landfill leachate, we don't want it building up in the landfill. It goes to a wastewater treatment plant, which may not be able to effectively remove it. And so it ends up in the waterways and the fish, potentially in the biosolids land applied to agricultural fields. So we are perpetuating the cycle. We're not really effectively removing them. And that's our challenge. We want to learn better how these materials move throughout the ecosystem, and then how do we effectively treat them, remove them, and protect public health. And so you'll hear people talk tonight about parts per trillion and the impact of these compounds in very, very small amounts. You see up here, 1 drop in 20 Olympic-sized swimming pools is a part per trillion. If you want to put it in a different context, 1 second in 32,000 years. So they're impactful at very, very minute amounts. Talk a little bit about how recently the PFAS compounds have become an issue in Michigan. And really one of the moments that it became obvious of concern is in the former Wurtsmith Air Force Base area, when we tested the fish there and had to issue a consumption advisory because of the high concentrations in fish tissue. We also started integrating the PFAS compounds into some surface water testing to find out, well, where are these compounds, you know, throughout our environment. Started finding a couple of things. One of them, if you look at what we call the connecting channels, the St. Mary's River, Detroit River, really low concentrations, maybe in that 2 part per trillion range, but then we started looking at some other areas around the state, and you start seeing them maybe up to like 4,000 or 5,000 parts per trillion, like up near Wurtsmith. So that started to raise the concern there. And then the military started looking at their installations around the globe because of the use of firefighting foam. And the folks at Camp Grayling came to us and said, you know, we've taken a groundwater sample. We've got some pretty high concentrations there. And then lastly, the folks out in West Michigan, you know, recognizing that PFAS compounds, in particular PFOS, for example, have been used in Scotchgard products that were applied at tanneries, and knowing historically how those materials had been managed there and disposed there, they started asking the state to look and say, we think we might have an issue out here. And so back in November of 2017, we came up with a very deliberate, comprehensive way to address this issue. And it was called the Michigan PFAS Action Response Team, established initially by an executive directive and then reaffirmed, reestablished this back in February of this year by an executive order to create a multi-agency cooperative approach. And you won't see this for anything else that we do in state government, where all of the agencies that are involved in environmental protection, agriculture, human health protection, natural resources, even airports and military facilities come together on this one issue to coordinate all state efforts. And it's not just state efforts either. We also have created a system to where we work with all levels of government, from local municipalities all the way up to our federal partners like EPA and the Federal Department of Health and Human Services. And one of our goals is to make sure that we are as transparent as possible and that we get input from folks like yourselves, industry, researchers, so that there's a recognition that we don't know everything about these compounds. There's a lot of research, a lot of input that we need as we go forward, and we continue to reach out to others, including other states and national associations, because if you paid attention to what's going on with this issue nationally, we don't have a lot of standards set at the federal level. So states like Michigan that are trying to, understand as quickly as possible how to manage these materials, we have to work with our other states that are doing something similar, share information, and so that benefit, leverage all of the work that everybody's doing. So I'll talk a little bit about 3 ways that we're trying to ensure that, first and foremost, that the one major exposure route that we have information about, which is drinking water, that's protected. And so the first thing that we do is we look at sites where we know or suspect that we have PFAS contamination. And any of those that have it over that 70 part per trillion, very low concentration, of PFOA and PFOS in groundwater, that we establish a process to, number one, make sure that nobody is drinking groundwater from those areas that's contaminated. And so that's the first thing that we do, and we can say that nobody around these 46 sites is drinking contaminated groundwater. That might mean we've had to provide them with filters and alternate water, but that's the first priority, making sure the citizens are informed on what we are doing there and looking for longer-term solutions to remediate those. It's a multi-agency response with DEQ, DHHS, and the rest of the MPART team. One thing to point out here too is, well, tonight we're going to talk about 5 of those facilities in this area, and many of the facilities, including all of those that we're talking about tonight, these are ones that have had contamination that we've been dealing with for years now. And we weren't looking for PFAS compounds when a lot of these remediation efforts began. So now we're adding it back and we're discovering it and having to modify our approaches to make sure that groundwater is protected, drinking water is protected going forward. So another thing that we're doing, aside from trying to investigate areas where we know there's contamination, is to get an understanding of what the occurrence of these compounds are in our drinking water supply, and where we find it to reduce those exposures. And so Michigan launched the first in the nation study of our public water supplies last year, and got some good news. 97% of all of the supplies do not have concentrations of PFAS that require any immediate action at this time. 62 of those supplies, about 3%, we did find some concentrations that they weren't at that public health action level, but they're a little higher than what we would consider that doesn't need any further response. So we actually now have committed as a state to monitor those supplies over the next year on a quarterly basis, supplies serving 500,000 Michiganders, to make sure that those levels are, number one, stable, and to work with those supplies to see if there's alternatives, if there's maybe some sources in the area that need to be remediated, and whether or not there's any longer-term solutions that need to be explored. And so we also, as I mentioned earlier, have integrated the PFAS investigation work into work that we do within the DEQ as just a matter of course, testing our surface waters and our fish for contaminants like we've been doing for mercury and PCBs over the years, to get a better understanding of what those exposures are. We've asked our public-owned wastewater treatment plants through their industrial pretreatment program to evaluate what the industrial users are in their system, and if there are high concentrations of PFAS coming into the headworks of their facilities, to reduce that, because again, some of those water supplies ultimately become drinking water supplies and would affect fish. And one of the things too that we're dealing with here in Michigan that not a lot of other states are struggling with is we have foam, PFAS foam, that is generated on some of our waterways where we have higher concentrations of PFAS. And that's and that foam is a concentrated form of PFAS, so we're trying to address that as well, get a better understanding of it. So, with that said, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie, talk a little bit more about what's going on locally with surface waters. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Kamer. I work in the Water Resources Division for the DQ. Normally, I'm the Lansing District Supervisor for our water quality programs, and we do permits to surface waters of the state. But right now, I've been doing PFAS pretty much full-time every day for the past year. So it's been an education for me. But my role here tonight is to talk to you about surface water sampling and fish tissue sampling that we've done in the Flint River over the years, and also to talk about some source tracking efforts that we've implemented, including Gilkey Creek. So, it worked for you, Steve. There we go. Okay, so before I get started, a lot of you might have heard of the drinking water criteria and the drinking water advisory levels, which is 70 parts per trillion for PFOS and PFOA combined. For surface waters, we have different criteria that were developed in Michigan, and they're listed up here. The human non-cancer values are the ones that are circled. They were developed, PFOA was developed in 2011, and PFOS was developed in 2014. And if you can see, there's a big difference between what we protect surface waters for between PFOS and PFOA. And we get a lot of questions in water about why are we protecting the fish? You know, that level's 12 and drinking water 70. What's going on? And what it is we're not protecting the fish. If you look at the other three criteria, those are the levels that protect the fish. They're much higher. PFOS, just the way it is, it accumulates very readily in the fish tissue, so we have to have very low concentrations in our surface waters in order to protect us when we eat the fish. So it's bioaccumulating in the fish, and we want to protect the people who want to eat those fish. So going through, I hope you guys can see this well, but this is a map of the Flint River. The city of Flint's right here in the middle. I do have the different sites that my other DEQ folks are going to talk about today. They're just on here so you have them a point of reference. You know, this first map's our sample that we did back in 2001. We weren't aware of any sites in the Flint River back then. This was like when PFAS was like a baby. You know, I don't think anybody was looking at PFAS very much. But the DQ, the question came up, you know, what are surface water concentrations for PFAS? So statewide, they selected a few rivers. The Flint River was one of those. They selected a sampling point pretty far downstream from where we are now at M13 before it went into the Shiawassee River. And these are the levels. So PFOS was 12 parts per trillion and PFOA was 11. Back then we didn't have any standards to compare that to, but it seemed pretty low. We didn't have any water quality standards to compare it to. They weren't developed until 2014 for PFOS, and PFOA was in 2011. So this is in 2013. There was a grant received between DEQ and DHHS to do another survey, a more comprehensive survey of Michigan surface waters for PFAS concentration in both the surface water and in fish. Flint River was revisited at that time. They took two samples. One was at Montrose and one was downstream, closer to where that M13 site was. The levels were higher in 2013 than what we saw in 2001. PFOS was 41 and 51, and then PFOA was 4 and 2. And so what we did with that, we knew once we saw those elevated levels and we had that PFAS standard that came out in 2014, we knew we were above standards. We also knew they'd collected fish during that sampling event, and in 2014 we knew we had elevated levels in the fish. So we thought it was pretty highly likely that there was a source to the Flint River, and we wanted to do a more intensive investigation to see if we could bracket the source. So this is where we get into some source tracking. At the time when we were doing this and planning it in 2015, the thought was, you know, we have all these old automotive, industrial applications and processes that were occurring in the Flint and the surrounding areas, as well as some landfills and dumps. And our likely source, significant source, would be in that area. We did an upstream, what we thought would be upstream of the source before we got to the Howley Dam, and we took some sample points along the main stem of the Flint all the way back up to the Montrose area. So all the samples results here that are in green, those are all on the main Flint River. If you can see, they're all in the teens for PFAS, so it's lower than what we saw in 2013. But our standard at this time is 12, so we are above standards. They're very consistent all the way through. So for us, when we looked at this, we thought, you know, we haven't found the source yet. It looks like we still need to go upstream because we still have these levels. They're hanging, they're pretty consistent. At the same time, in 2016, we took samples of some sludge tributaries. Swartz Creek was 7 for PFOS. That was meeting our water quality standards. Gilby Creek was 12. That's right at the standard. And then Kearsley Creek was 6. PFOA for all of our surface water samples were very low, and our standard for PFOA was much higher. It's 12,000 parts per trillion. So based on that, we knew we still had more work to do. So in 2017, we came back and did additional sampling going further upstream. And this is the map that shows all of the sampling that was done on the main stem of the Flint again. And we also, during that time, thought, you know, we've done some literature review, we're learning about PFAS and potential sources, and it would probably be a good idea to look at wastewater treatment plants. We hadn't sampled any plants at that time in Michigan yet, and we wanted to see if that could be a potential source here in the Flint River. So we selected the 3 biggest. They're the Genesee County Ragnon, which is down here at Montrose, the Flint wastewater treatment plant, and the Lapeer wastewater treatment plant. And the wastewater treatment plants, they treat sanitary sewage and industrial process waters from their users and discharge it to the Flint River. So based on, you know, that year, you know, the surface water sampling is a grab sample. It's a snapshot in time. So we see fluctuations. It can depend on the flow of the river. It can depend on the year. You know, groundwater tables are low. We see a lot of up and down. So it's hard to draw a lot of conclusions from one sampling event. In 2017, we actually had really low levels in the Flint River. But then when we got to the Lapeer wastewater plant results, you know, we saw that that was very elevated. And so we immediately shifted from, you know, looking for a source to knowing we had a source and working in Lapeer to identify their industrial user to their system and put controls in place to treat that. So that's ongoing still. They have put treatment in at the facility there, and we have much lower levels now. So circling back though, in that same event in 2017, we didn't just look at the main stem and we didn't just look upstream. We also wanted to revisit some of those tributaries and make sure that we weren't missing anything. And so we went back to Swartz Creek. We took 2 samples. One was upstream of the airport and one was downstream. They were both, you know, one was non-detect and one was 3, so well within our standards. We also went to Thread Creek, it was 2. And then we got to Gilpie Creek, and Gilpie Creek was 25, so that stood out to us. When we circled back to it and we looked at potential uses on Gilpie Creek, we thought there was a high potential that we had a source there. And so then we started a new source tracking sampling plan to look specifically at Gilpie Creek in 2017. And for those who might not be familiar with Gilpie Creek, this is where it's located. These parts of Burton, a little bit of Davison, and then it goes into the city. And I think it empties right below Hamilton Avenue or Davison Road. And so, oh, okay. So this is the Gilpie Creek Source Investigation Area. This is the Flint River here. It flows coming downstream. Gilpie Creek, flows this way towards the Flint River. We really concentrated our efforts based on that 2017 data. We had a sample here at the mouth that was 25, and we had another sample here at Center Road that was, I have to go back, but I think it was like 3. It was meeting standards. And when we looked at the industrial applications in this area, we thought we had some good hits. So we started working there. And I'm going to go through, we've ended up, I didn't put this all because it was a really busy slide, but we do have it all online on the MPART website under the Flint River Watershed page, and it shows you all the surface water samples that we have taken in the Gilpie Creek area. But basically, we've taken, I think, 3 different sampling events in 2017 and 2 additional events in 2018. And consistently, we've been meeting standards up here at Center Road. As we travel down the river, we start getting elevated above our water quality standards. And then as you turn and go towards Court Street, there's another spike up. So I think we're pretty good at where we're looking right now. It's just we need to find the source and to see if there's something that could be corrected. So I'm going to go through the different areas we've looked over the past about 1.5 years. This is the Davison Road landfill. This is actually located, I think Center Road's right here. The Davison Road West landfill is operated by Racer Trust. I think this is a city municipally, maybe one of my landfill people can help me, but municipally owned over here. Racer Trust agreed, even though they weren't really in our area of concern, to look at some monitoring wells that are right on the river and do some groundwater monitoring. They did 5 wells, and all the PFAS results came back very low. So if you look, this is PFOS, and then this is PFOA. I think there was a 6 and a 5, and the totals are way below both the health advisory levels and the Part 201 groundwater cleanup protection levels. So we don't feel that the landfill is a significant source to what we're seeing in Gilpie Creek. We also knew we had the former Delphi manufacturing facility that had several plants up above Robert T. Longway, right in the vicinity of the Gilpie Creek. We knew that they did plating. We knew that they had AFFF foam that was used. So we wanted to look there and see if they had a potential source. There were some groundwater samples that were taken at plant 400 and plant 600, and here are the results for those. Those again came back very low. So PFOS, the highest was 4, and we had a non-detect and a 10 and a 10. And PFOA were all non-detects except for 1, that was 1. And the totals are here. So again, we're meeting criteria. There's a little bit of PFAS there, but we don't have like a smoking gun based on these samples. We also looked on Kelso Street. There's a facility there that does field treating. Initially, they weren't on our priority to go talk to them, but we were out there talking to their neighbor and went next door to do inspection there to see if they used PFAS compounds, and we learned that they had had a fire in 2006 and that AFFF foam was used on that fire to help put it out. And so we know AFFF foam is a potential source for PFAS. We've since then taken some samples of soils along that property and some stormwater, and we do get some hits, and we are above our surface water standards for the stormwater, which would be 12. So we had a 44 in the discharge from the site to the Gilpie Creek, and we have some soils that, when you do soils and you do fish tissue, it's going to be parts per billion. So normally we're talking parts per trillion, but when we get into solids, we're talking parts per billion. So the soil at one location was 30. So we think this is a potential source. We're going to be working with that facility. They have an NPDES permit. It's a stormwater permit. And we're going to work with them to try to characterize it and find out where the PFAS is. So there's a couple of other locations that we're still looking for data and looking to gather more information on. There was a former wastewater treatment plant that was located right on Gilpie Creek that served the Delphi operations, and there's also a disposal area. We tried to get some groundwater samples from both of these areas. The disposal area, they actually couldn't get to the groundwater, and so it doesn't appear that there's a groundwater venting issue because they went there right next to the creek and they couldn't reach it. They're also, at the wastewater plant, while they tried to get a sample, the site conditions, it's an active site being used for whatever the property owner's using, but he's got a lot of equipment and materials and we just couldn't access it. So we're not quite done with those areas yet. There's storm sewers that drain in these areas and we've sampled those storm sewers and we found PFAS, so we're going to be circling back to look at that more.
Can I ask something? That dumps right into Kersey Creek, Guilty Creek, my backyard. That big manhole, I see that full of that foam. You guys need to start right off Kersey Boulevard at that huge manhole because it's pumping that out. And everything in that creek is not green, not orange, it's all.
I would be happy to talk with you if you have something that we should be looking at. No, I'm more than happy to talk to anybody who wants to point us in a direction.
Get a hold of some of the residents.
Okay. So just wrapping this up, because I know I'm probably over my time, but there are a couple other sites we did inspect along Kelso Road. There's a plater there, which everybody said, PFAS is known to be with platers. However, this plater happens to be a trichome plater. They had no PFAS use history at the plater because with trichome plating, you don't need to use it like you do with hexchrome plating. And we did sample their wastewater just to be sure, and it was non-detect, so we ruled them out. And we also checked their neighbor, who was an automotive industry, and they had never used PFAS in the past. So our next steps for the Water Resources Division, we're going to be working with the City of Flint to come back. These yellow lines are some of the storm sewers that drain into Gilkey Creek, and we have sampled several of them. 3 of them are above our water quality criteria, so we're going to work with the city to come back and see if we can't bracket where that PFAS is. If we can get up it, and then we can see, do we need to clean out the storm drains? Do we have an active source that we can address? So that's what we're going to do for Gilkey Creek. We're also going to collect some surface water samples. This is kind of out of this area, but at the south branch of the Flint River, because that's where the Lapeer plant discharges, and we're just going to see how that's doing over there. The last time we sampled, it was really low, even though we had a high discharge from Lapeer. So we just want to go back, and we'll probably keep doing that as time goes on to make sure we're still making progress. We're also going to take some fish from Kearsley Reservoir. We haven't collected any fish for PFAS sampling at that place, so we're going to look there because we know it's used for fisheries. And then finally, we're going to work with our confirmed sources. So as we find sources that we have identified that are discharging to surface waters above standards, we're going to work with them to see if we can't get corrective actions in place and eliminate that, or at least reduce that to our standard discharge. And this is a map that just shows where we've collected fish. And I put up here what the levels were. Again, when you have solids, it's going to be in parts per billion and not parts per trillion. But this is what, triggered kind of this whole thing. As we looked at the fish, we saw these elevated levels of PFAS, and this drove advisories for fish consumption that Doug's going to talk about later. But we think that looking at the fish is a better way than just grabbing surface waters to kind of see how consistent are these fish exposed to PFAS. So if we have elevated levels, we feel like there is a source, and I think we're going to keep working on it. All right. So now I'm going to hand it over to Al Taylor.
Good evening. Can you hear me okay? Okay, my name's Al Taylor. I'm with the Department of Environmental Quality, Waste Management, and Radiologic Protection Division. I'm the manager of the Hazardous Waste Program. I've got Nicole Sanabria over here. She is the project geologist for the Coldwater Road site that I'll be talking about. The project manager for the first site I'm going to be talking about, the Racer Buick City site, is actually at leadership training on a 10-day training session, and is not available to be here tonight. So You'll have to bear with me. I don't have the same level of information that Kevin Lund, the project manager, or Nicole does for Coldwater Road. We do have racer representatives here. I'll be happy to take any questions and get back with you on any answers that I may not have. So with that, go ahead and get started here. Okay. All right, the first site that we're going to be looking at is Buick City. This is kind of Genesee County. Buick City is right here where the red dot is. We'll be talking about Coldwater Road landfill, and then shortly Jim Arduin from our solid waste program will be talking about Richfield landfill, and then Paul Buchholz will be talking about the Flint Bishop International Airport. Okay, background. As most of you know, Racer Trust is the bankruptcy trust for the former GM Corporation. Michigan has a high number of bankruptcy sites from the GM bankruptcy, and the Racer Trust is a fund that has been allocated for the cleanup of these historic GM sites. Racer is under oversight by US EPA and DEQ. The first site we're going to talk about, Racer Buick City, is actually an EPA lead site. DEQ is the support site, and EPA and DEQ are responsible for managing the Racer Buick City site, completing remediation related to the former GM contamination, and getting the site ready for reuse. That's the mission of the trust. As I mentioned, US EPA is the lead agency. We'll actually be here, actually over next to the Racer site at the Metropolitan Baptist Church on Myrtle Street, adjacent to the site, for a previously scheduled public meeting that's being hosted by Racer Trust. A lot of the same people here tonight will be at that meeting, and that meeting will provide a deeper dive into the data if that's something that you're interested in. There are flyers out there for that. The support agency, DEQ, has a project manager for the site. His name is Kevin Lund, and if you have any questions that we can't answer, we're going to get them to Kevin and to the trust, and we'll get answers back for you. Okay, the public meeting that I just talked about, there are flyers out there. It's from 6 to 8 next Thursday night. And it was scheduled previously before this meeting was scheduled, or maybe we could have aligned them a little bit better.
You know which day
It's right outside before you come in. But we'll make sure we'll get it to you. So I'm gonna have to back up here one slide. On the background, as Steve mentioned, our overall mission is we are cleaning up these sites to protect human health and the environment. And we want to put them safely back into productive use. We have a team approach. US EPA is the lead on this site with the DEQ as a support agency. We work with the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services and the Genesee County Health Department. In fact, Jim Henry has been coordinating periodic update meetings on all of the sites that we're talking about here tonight, and it's doing an excellent job at the local level, keeping all these cogs together and keeping people informed. The update meetings include folks from all of the sites and the affected localities, including Flint and the community adjacent. I'm spacing out on the name of the Lakefront Association for Richfield. Yes, Lake Association. And of course, there's coordination and oversight of the Racer Trust facility. So I'm going to see if I can go back to this. Okay, there you go. How's work being prioritized? This is important, okay? As Steve mentioned, we're focusing on making sure that nobody's drinking contaminated groundwater. Drinking water wells are an important pathway for this contaminant, and we put a lot of effort into trying to find everybody who's on a domestic well in an area of contamination and checking that well and getting them on safe water as appropriate. Okay. The surface water pathway, basically Flint River in this case, is very important. We are investigating what contamination is getting into the Flint River. The pathways that we're concerned about here are the storm sewers, sanitary sewers, and actually groundwater venting into the river. I left that off the slide, but I should have. The things that we're trying to protect in the river are, as talked about a little bit, are fish and drinking water from the river. No one's drinking water from the Flint River now, but we know it occurred in the past and it could occur in the future. We also need to control the site until cleanup is completed to prevent people from coming in contact with contaminated soils. And we also have an air component to this. We need to make sure dust and vapors are controlled during cleanup activities and when the site is just sitting there. So this all requires multi-divisional effort between the Waste Management and Radiological Protection Division, RRD, the Water Resources Division, and the Air Quality Division of the DEQ, working in concert with local public health, DHHS, EPA. So this is a very integrated team approach. So this is just some location information on the Duke City site. You can see the Flint River in here. We have a little bit better geography here. I'm looking at a screen down here, and I really can't see it very well. So I hope you can see it better up here. This site, an important component of this, or that a lot of people don't recognize, is, this is 2 miles through here. This is a very large site. So there is a lot, it's very old. It's, started around the turn of the last century and went all the way in, to just about, through the bankruptcy. So this is not an easy lift. It's an old site. Things have moved around a lot on the site. We don't even know what activities with clarity happened at each part of the site right now. Okay. This is the site turned on its side. North is now going this way, so we can get more information on the page. But all these dots on here represent different environmental samples that have been collected in the ongoing investigation.
Would a better copy of them?
Is that?
A better copy of this be available at your next meeting?
Yeah, in fact, one of the things, all of these maps we took from the Racer Buick City website, so that you can actually go on.
So I'm asking you to bring a better copy of your demonstration to our next meeting. And have you all considered giving us an actual hard copy of what you're presenting?
Yes.
Because I can't see that.
Okay, and
we will be able to,
yeah, if we can perhaps dim the lights a little bit too.
I think that'll help.
so we will get this information online, okay? And the folks here are going to be able to ask questions after the presentation.
Okay.
Thanks, Jack.
Okay. So these, this map, I want to make sure. Okay, so this is a kind of a summary of all the environmental information. And there are a lot of dots on there. There's a lot of samples being collected of water, groundwater, surface water, sewers, sanitary sewers, and the outfalls to the rivers, and soil samples. I apologize, that's difficult to see. This might be a little bit better. This is showing the groundwater samples that have been collected at the site. And again, this looks like a lot of dots on a map, but again, this is 2 miles, so we still have a lot of investigation to do. This is you know, we need a lot better density of data. So this is something that is being developed. Okay. The drinking water pathway, that was groundwater on the site. This shaded area here, I hope it shows up. I agree, it doesn't show up very well on the screen. This shaded area here is a conservative estimate of the area that could potentially be affected by contaminated groundwater found on the Buick city property. Does that help at all?
Yeah.
Yes, the shaded area is a conservative estimate of the area that could potentially be affected by contaminated groundwater found on the Buick city property. And one thing that's kind of unique about Genesee County is that there's a lot of people on municipal water here, city water, but there are also drinking water wells in the city. That's kind of unusual, and that makes it pretty difficult because sometimes there's not a lot of good records on who's got wells. Racer, under EQ and EPA oversight, and assistance from the Genesee County Health Department, evaluated water well records and active water connections. One of the better ways to find out if people have a well or not is if they're getting a water bill. So doesn't mean that's the only way, no, but it is a line of evidence. And there's field verification that needs to happen. And Kevin spent a lot of time driving around neighborhoods looking for wells. So based on the data sources that we've reviewed and the field verifications, we do not believe groundwater is being used for drinking water in areas likely to be impacted by this Racer cold water road site. That could change. One of the things that we're asking, and it's an ask to people especially who live in that area, if you know of a well that's being used for drinking water in or around this area, we're asking you to contact Mr. Lund or myself. If someone knows about one tonight, we'd love to have that information because we are not going to pretend that we're 100% confident that we found every well out there. There's a lot of, and that's the local community part of this is important for this. Okay. Okay, now we're looking at, these are areas where some cleanup has already been conducted at the site. And obviously these little blocks here, there's a lot more site that needs to be addressed. The Racer cleanup is being overseen by EPA, I mentioned. They are coming out later this spring, might be early summer, with something called a statement of basis. And that's basically their overall plan for conducting site remedy at the site. There's going to be a public comment period on that. There's going to be a public hearing so people can provide comments on it. We'll be working with EPA on that. So this is going to be a great opportunity for the general public to have input into the overall remedy that is to be conducted at this site. So a lot of these are like soil removals, free product removals, bulkheading, sewers, things like that to prevent contamination from getting to the river. Again, this is the sanitary sewer systems here, and these purple blob areas are areas where we have strong suspicions that PFAS was used, and we look at sanitary sewers adjacent to those, and also storm sewers. The reason sewers are important is because contaminated groundwater, if the sewer pipe is below the groundwater table, that contaminated groundwater or oil can leak into the sewer pipe and then get transferred out to the river or go to the wastewater treatment plant. So a lot of the remedial action on the site is going to be controlling the surface water or the storm water and sanitary conduits to the river or to the wastewater treatment plant. Again, these are storm sewers. There's a whole bunch of outfalls, meaning that's where pipes discharge the water to the river. Oh, and this is Flint River over here. And all those circles represent outfalls. And we're working with Racer and Water Resources Division to get all of those sampled and understand So the early actions that have occurred at this site have been bulkheading certain sewers on the site to prevent contaminated groundwater and oils present at the site from getting out into the river. There's a lot more work to do there. This is just a little graphic about how a storm sewer that is above the water table, like here, this would be the water table, doesn't have contamination leaking into it. It could have contamination leaking out into the groundwater system, but it doesn't leak in. If the sewer is below the water table or in the water table, contamination can get into the pipe through cracks in the joinery in the sewer system. So that is a significant pathway at the site. I'm just showing this picture to let you know that these blobs, these orange things right here, these are areas where oil is present that needs to be addressed. We call that light non-aqueous phase liquid, but it's an oil that can leak into the sewers and is a long-term source of contamination that needs to be controlled and addressed. Okay, so the next steps, we're going to complete additional groundwater investigation, complete stormwater sewer investigations, monitoring at the outfalls, additional soil investigation. EPA is going to hold public hearing on cleanup options called the Statement of Basis, and that's going to be in late spring or summer. We need to further evaluate potential exposure pathways to determine what additional work is necessary. We're going to do something called interim response activities. That means if there's something that needs to be done now or should be done now rather than waiting for the entire remedy to be implemented, we'll do it. So, or RACER will do it. And RACER is responsible for implementing the cleanup under oversight from the DEPA and DEQ in this case. So, going on to Coldwater Road landfill. Same things apply. We are concerned about pathways, people getting exposed to water either through drinking it, through surface water getting off-site, to storm water getting off-site. So, this is a large site. It's 230 acres in size. It's located, if you see the bend in 475 here, most people know where that is. It's right off to the side. This boat-like thing right here is the landfill that was constructed back in the 90s to contain the plating wastes that resulted from cleanups through this area. At one point in time, this was the largest plating operation on the planet. And the reason that's important here is PFAS is associated, PFAS in particular, is associated with one of the industrial hygiene components. They used to mist the stuff to keep the chrome levels down in air to protect workers. Ironically, it's also a fantastic environmental contaminant, and when we had all of this stuff cleaned up in here and put in this landfill and taken off-site to other landfills, we did not know there was PFAS in there at the time, and we did not get all the PFAS. We have a great cleanup for the metals, for the chrome, the nickel, that type of thing here, but that is an issue now that we deal with. This site was substantially done, and we have a number of sites all over the state that we're having now to reopen and do additional cleanup work because of this contaminant or class of contaminant.
You know where it's all from?
We have sites that we've already worked on cleaning up. We have.
I said, do you know where they're all from? Do you know all the sites that were dumped on?
No, we don't know all of them yet. So, started in 1951, a lot of manufacturing and plating. Prior to 1995, plating wastes were treated in on-site wastewater treatment plant that had several associated features, including settling ponds, dewatering lagoons, and a sludge land application area. So basically, this stuff was managed all over the site and in ponds and things like that. Things that we now know are really unacceptable ways to manage pollutants, but back in the day, that was the way it was done. Talk same thing about Racer here. On this site, the DEQ is the lead agency. We coordinate in the same way with EPA. Rich Conforti is the Hazardous Waste Section Project Manager. And again, if you have any questions that we can't answer tonight, we'll capture them and follow up with you. The remediation of this site, 800,000 tons of contaminated soil were managed at this site and disposed in that boat-looking landfill and off-site. I have to say that this would have been a much worse site of environmental contamination if that cleanup had not been done. There's a lot of PFAS in that landfill. We just didn't get it all when we did it. What's it? This was in the 1990s.
Where did they go? Come nobody knew about it. That's what I'm just saying. We already know that the poison water in Flint with the lead and everything, so they had to, the PFAS is connected with the lead. So you're actually telling us that we've been poisoned. I gotta be quiet with the questions.
Okay, we've done a number of rounds of groundwater, surface water, and stormwater investigations related to PFAS. A bunch of borings, 20 new monitoring wells, and 108 groundwater samples, and 15 residential well samples. There are drinking water wells in this area, and they have been sampled. We have detected PFAS in one very deep well in the area. It doesn't make sense at this point because we're not finding it in the intervening area. What we think has happened in this case is that when the well was installed, it was drilled through some shallow contamination, and then that provided a conduit for it to get down the borehole. That, regardless, it resulted from the contamination being there, and Racer is replacing that well. Hopefully that'll resolve the problem. Otherwise, I'm not sure how I'm going to explain why there's PFAS 260 feet down, because it's not consistent with what we understand about it now. There's about 20,000 gallons of leachate from the landfill that has high levels of PFAS in it that's treated through carbon to acceptable levels and discharged to the municipal wastewater system. The groundwater impacts appear to be related to the former wastewater treatment ponds, lagoons, and land application area. The extent of PFAS migration in groundwater is still being investigated. We think we understand it pretty well, but again, we have this deeper contamination that is, it's requiring some additional work. And we found PFAS in the shallow groundwater up to approximately 3,000 parts per trillion. So we have some pretty significant concentrations. Okay, there's also stormwater draining off-site that was found to contain PFAS above the 12 parts per trillion level that Stephanie talked about. On-site ponds are also contaminated with PFAS above the water quality standards. Initial efforts to control this included bulkheading the sewer to keep the water from going off-site in an uncontrolled manner. We still got some work to do there because when you bulkhead something, that water's still going to go somewhere. It doesn't just stop accumulating. So this is just another one of those and I apologize, these are very large sites and there's a lot of information to share. Here's a landfill here. This is area where those residential drinking water wells were sampled, and we have some detections in there, that area there. This is the former Peregrine plating operation portion right here. These are the ponds over here that have PFAS contamination associated with them. So a site that thought we were done with, we're just getting back started again. Next step, that residential water well is being replaced. We're completing the additional groundwater investigation. and completing additional investigation on site ponds and evaluate ways to prevent the off-site or manage the off-site discharges. We're going to monitor groundwater and stormwater and further evaluate the potential exposure pathway to figure out what work is necessary. Thank you. I'll now have Jim Arduin come up and talk briefly about Richfield landfill.
I am Jim Arduin. I'm the site lead for the Richfield landfill. I was told we're running a little behind time, so I'm going to kind of go through this quickly. I only have the one slide. Richfield landfill is at 11145 East Mount Morris Road, so it's up by the Holloway Reservoir. As a matter of fact, it's just north of it. The site itself is about 300 acres in size, so it's a pretty good sized site. And on that site, we have landfill cells that cover about 79 acres. So there's some pretty good sized landfill cells on that site. The landfill itself was built over the course of several decades. The newer cells that you see up in the top section up here, 1, 2, and 3, those are built using the newer technologies and newer design standards. So they have liners underneath them and they have leachate collection. And the monitoring wells near those cells would indicate that they are not releasing contaminants to the groundwater at this point. The old fill section, on the other hand, was built decades ago, and the construction standards at the time didn't include liner system, didn't include leachate collection systems. So over the course of time, as the groundwater went down, it did contact the waste, and it did cause groundwater impact at this site. At that time, Richfield landfill did an investigation at the site. They determined the extent of the impact, and that's highlighted by that yellow dashed line that you see up there. And the other thing that the investigation also told us was that there's a protected clay layer that separates that upper impacted aquifer from the lower aquifer, which is where the local residents get their drinking water from. So that's a good thing. In addition to the investigation, Richfield also proposed a remedial action for the site, and they implemented that action. That action included things like a groundwater extraction system to try to catch impacted groundwater as it leaves the site, right down in this area down here. This white shaded area here is an area that Richfield landfill had worked with Genesee County to establish a restriction for drinking water wells in that area. It's not that you can't put them there, it's just that if you do put them, they have to go to the lower aquifer, which is below that clay layer. So Richfield had done all that, and then in 2013 they went bankrupt. So we were stuck with this site. At that time, the landfill operations ceased, and we went in and we continued to extract the leachate from the landfill cells and to send it to the wastewater treatment plant. We also continue to keep the remediation system running. And we've done some limited sampling to try to make sure that the plume configuration and concentrations haven't changed over time. So we've done that since 2013. And then in 2018, in April, we realized that this site needed to be looked at for PFAS. So at that time, we sampled 2 wells. We picked the MW3, which is the upper blue dot right here. We picked that one because it was the well that has consistently showed the highest impact at the site. We wanted to see, we figured if there was PFAS, we would see it in that well. We also picked this well here, which is on the property, but before the impact would leave the site. We wanted to know if we did have PFAS, was it leaving the site and at what concentrations. So we did that in April of 2018, and we did find PFAS. So I'm here. And the numbers on this well up here were above our drinking or groundwater protection standard and above the water quality that as it moves further down the property, the concentrations there are below both the groundwater protection standard and the water quality standard. So that's good news. What that tells us is that it's not leaving the site at concentrations that would be of concern to us. But we still had residential wells in this impacted area. I also forgot to mention that in addition to the extraction system and the restriction on the drink or the on where you put the wells, they also put in an extension to the municipal water, and that's this blue line right here. So the residents were given an option at that time. If they didn't want to be in that deeper aquifer for whatever reason, they could have hooked up to the municipal water. But we still had folks that wanted to stay on their drinking water. So in October, because of these results, we did have the impact. We did want to test our site model and make sure that that clay layer was protective. So we went out and I picked 3 wells that I thought if we were going to see it in the drinking water wells, it would be these wells. They were the most susceptible to an impact. The good news is we got those results back and they were all non-detect. So at this site, the path forward, we don't plan on doing any additional drinking water well sampling unless we get some other information. So if anybody's aware of shallow well, drinking water well in this area, we certainly want to know that because we would need to look into that. But we don't plan on doing any additional drinking water well sampling at this time. But we do want to continue sampling these 2 wells here and some other key wells just to make sure that the concentrations and the configuration of that plume don't change. We don't want to see, obviously, this number going above 11, because that would be something that we would have to react to. But at this point in time, we're kind of in a monitor mode on this, which is kind of good news. So that's the Richfield. We haven't checked the animals at this site.
So where's the storm runoff at?
Well, the storm runoff is basically all the way around the landfill. That water, when it hits the top of that landfill, doesn't touch the waste anymore. There's a barrier between the waste and the surface, so it just looks like a grass field out there. When it rains, it runs off, but it's what we call non-contact water, is not impacted.
So they never got anything from you yet?
They probably did, but I think they were looking more for just runoff from that landfill to adjacent areas.
So I was in Flint, Warren, and had the choice of not having to drink water unless storm runoff.
I guess I'm not following the question. These folks here were offered an alternative.
But that water runs.
But the water that's running off this site is, if it's coming across the top of the land, it's not impacted, it's not contaminated because it doesn't touch the waste. If it's going through the groundwater, this data point here would indicate that it's below the water quality standard, so it's not increasing the PFAS concentrations in the Flint River.
Are you sure about that?
I'm sure about that, based on the data that we have.
The river study from July 2011 says that it makes a huge impact if they got an MPV.
I'm not familiar with the report you're talking about. If you want, we can talk about it after.
Yeah, I really do. I need to read.
But we need to kind of keep this moving along. That's what I had on Richfield. If you folks have questions afterwards, jot them down. We should be available and back. So, thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Hello, my name is Paul Woltz, and I'm the project manager for the City of Flint landfill at the Bishop Airport. So I'm here to talk to you about that. I work in our remediation redevelopment division, so a little bit different than some of the other folks here, but we look more at like soil and groundwater contamination. That's what brings me here. To get you oriented, I first of all, I want to let you know everyone's probably familiar with where the Bishop Airport is. And the landfill itself is located where you see that red dot there, this red box. This is the landfill area. This is the east-west runway and the north-south runway. This is 69 here, right? We got Bristol Road that runs along here, and then this is Linden Road. So that kind of gets you dialed in. But the old landfill's more on the west end of the runway there, closer to Linden Road. Now, this came to our attention. I can put a zoom in. That's that same kind of red box, but it's zoomed in more here. This came to our attention back in about 2006, 2007. We started getting complaints of water kind of seeping out of the landfill. And, you know, this isn't a fancy landfill like you might think of with the others that was constructed with the liners and everything. This is more, back in the day, we'd call it a dump. You know, this was here, they had some, put some cells in, they bring the garbage in, burn it or whatever. And it operated from about 1966, the mid-60s until the mid-70s, at which point they were getting a lot of complaints. They didn't get their license, and so they shut it down. When they shut it down, they just basically put a little clay on top of it. And when you're out there now, and you're driving over it, the road's real up and down. It's just kind of a settling area there. And it's pretty flat, and so you can get a lot of pooling water. And anyway, around 2006, 2007, we were getting complaints about this water kind of seeping out of this old landfill into the ditch and going into Swartz Creek. So we worked with the city of Flint and had them do an investigation out here to figure out what's going on. No one had really looked at this thing. So they looked at the soil and groundwater, and this is before the PFAS days, so PFAS was not part of this investigation. In 2013, they finalized the report. They kind of summarized the conditions that they found out there. Now, what we found here is that generally, like Jim was talking earlier, there's a clay that runs underneath the landfill. This waste was put on top of clay. And the water generally runs, when we look at the groundwater, it collects and pools in the middle here and then runs out here towards Swartz Creek, which is on the east edge here. And then Hewitt Drain runs along the west edge. So the groundwater kind of goes across the top of this clay and goes out to these surface water bodies. So after we got this investigation back at the city of Flint, the state of Michigan, because Flint didn't have a lot of resources here, we came up with some money to look at a presumptive remedy to cap this, because what our conceptualization was is the water's kind of coming in, it's sitting on that flat top, it's soaking in, and then it's running across the clay and going out to the surface water. So the idea was to put a cap on it, kind of reshape it to keep the water from infiltrating, dry it out, and then that would control the risks out here. We started that, we hired a contractor and started doing the design to look at how we would cap this landfill back in early 2018. Now about this time, this PFAS issue came up, right? And so we're starting to hear about it more in the office, and unlike some of the areas in the city here, we have a lot more people in private wells out, especially to the west and south of the airport here. So we thought, well, we've got existing wells, we better sample those and see what we have. So we went out in the summer of 2018, and that's kind of what you can see here. The white dots are the wells that we went and sampled. The green dots were existing wells that are out there that we didn't sample. So we did half of them, we did 6, tried to get some aerial coverage. And what we found, like Jim said, the reason we're here is because we did find PFAS, and the highest concentrations we found up on the north side there, about 810 parts per trillion of these combined PFAS concentrations. So this is a little kind of cartoon, a little summary of our conceptual site model. Again, we've got the waste that's sitting on top of clay. And this groundwater, we think the shallow groundwater is heading to these surface waters on both sides of the landfill. Now, our wells that we put out there for this study are pretty shallow. They're in the upper 20, 25 feet is the deepest, but they're generally much shallower than that. So we're just looking at that water that occurs in the waste. But because we've got the landfill issues out here, and because this is PFAS, we're going to go out and we're going to do some additional investigation. And our plan is to set deeper wells, because the people, we went and evaluated some of the well logs that we had for the area, and we found that almost everyone's wells are set in this deeper bedrock that's below the clay. And so that would be the threat, is if this deeper bedrock aquifer were impacted. So we're going to do an additional investigation. We just met with the airport authority last week to come up with a plan for how we can set some wells out there, get an idea of where this deeper groundwater is flowing, because we know very little about it, and make sure that it's safe and that exposure pathway is protected. So that is the plan, and we're hoping to be able to get those wells in yet this spring or early summer. So just to recap some of the key points, the investigation was completed in 2013. The groundwater looks at the shallow unit that's sitting above this clay out there. It's not being used for drinking water. That we sampled the wells in the summer of 2018, and then 3 of the 6 exceeded the 70 parts per trillion. That's why we're here. Anytime we see groundwater above that 70, it kind of puts us in this PFAS realm here. The criteria for that surface water is 12 parts per trillion. And the highest concentration we found was 810 combined PFAS with flow. The drinking water wells in there are pretty deep, around 60 to 210 feet. They're in that deeper bedrock. If we find out about shallow wells, we're going to sample those. We found out about one recently and actually went out today and had it sampled, so that's going to be some additional information for us. Again, Swartz Creek, we think the shallow water is probably going towards it, and we do have some surface water sampling that's conducted both upstream and downstream of the airport. All those concentrations in Swartz Creek are below the criteria of 12 part per trillion. So our next steps, we're going to continue coordinating. We're working with a lot of people on this. We're working with Genesee County Health Department, the State Health Department, the Airport Authority. We gave a presentation at Flint Township on Monday, just trying to keep everyone involved and making sure that we're getting the information out there. We're going to install those deeper wells. That's our plan. We think we got some locations set out. We got to get some final word back from the Airport Authority because it's kind of tricky putting wells in the airport with those plans. And then it's going to help us. Our plan is with those wells in that deeper unit, we're going to know whether that PFAS has penetrated this clay unit, which we hope it hasn't, and then we're going to have a better handle on how that deeper unit is flowing, so we can help target our investigation in the future should we need to do that. Again, we're hoping this spring to get the wells in. It kind of depends on some factors, but that's what we're shooting for. And then concurrent with this, we're also working with the Airport Authority to investigate, because they have a history of firefighting foam use out here too. So we're working with them concurrently to investigate that. We don't have any indications at this time of impact from that activity. So that is all I have for right now.
Okay, guys, I know you guys have been listening to this a lot, and you're probably about done, but bear with me just for a little bit. Okay.
We want to hear this.
Okay, so I'm here from the Department of Health and Human Services, the State Health Department, and my name is Deb Mackenzie-Taylor. Our role is to work with both the Department of Environmental Quality, EPA when they're working on a site, and the local health department and the local community to try to make sure that the public health is protected. So I'm not going to do this because Steve talked to you about that, and then you've heard about sources. But I do want to give you a little bit of information about what kind of PFAS levels we've seen in people. And this is actually across the nation. There's a study that's done every year. It's called the National Health and Nutrition Survey, NHANES. And they've been collecting PFAS data in people's blood across the nation since 2000. And so we have data up through 2014. And as you can see, the two chemicals that our best studies, PFOA and PFOS, have been voluntarily taken off the market in this country. So the levels have dropped since that happened. We have other chemicals that haven't been included in the NHANES study that have been replacement chemicals. So we'll have to see if we're seeing what kind of levels we're seeing of those chemicals. So.
They was testing for lead.
Okay. So I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about exposure to PFAS chemicals. So one of the things to understand is that these are not something that you get exposed today and you have problems the next day. These are things that take time to build up in your body. As Steve talked about, they accumulate in people's bodies. And so it's not something that it's a short term, happens right away. It takes time for it to build up in your body. And then it also takes a lot of time when you stop being exposed for it for your body to get rid of it. The other thing is if you have been exposed to PFAS chemicals, it doesn't mean that you're going to have a health effect associated with it. I'm going to talk to you in the next slide about some of the health outcomes, but keep in mind that everybody that's exposed is not going to have a health outcome. Even at high levels, everybody exposed is not going to have a health outcome associated with PFAS. So I'll talk to you about that next. So what kind of health outcomes are associated with PFOA or PFAS exposure? Those are the two chemicals we know the most about. There's a site in the Ohio River Valley where DuPont manufactured these chemicals. Little Hocking, Ohio had the largest water treatment or water utility in that area. So there were drinking water wells and 3 water systems in that area that were impacted by that manufacturing site. They had over 65,000 people that were drinking water at various levels, from non-detect to 14,000 parts per trillion. The average level in Little Hocking, Ohio was 3,500 parts per trillion. So what they did was they had a group of scientists, epidemiologists, who came in and did what we call a health study, where they measured levels of people's blood, not everybody, but a percentage of the people. And then they looked at what kind of health impacts these people had associated with both their drinking water intake and their blood level and what health outcomes they had. And what they saw was that some people, not everybody, but some of the people in that area had increased incidence or higher amounts of some of these outcomes that I have under humans. So some women had a decreased ability to get pregnant. Some of them had hypertension during pregnancy. They also saw increased thyroid disease. They also saw increased cholesterol. And then they saw, not in this study, but they've seen in some other studies, especially exposure to young children, altered immune response, so decreased titers to vaccines. And then also in this study, they saw increased testicular and kidney cancer. So we also typically, this study, as I said, in C8, most of the time when you're looking at people that have been exposed, they're not exposed to one chemical. So it's really hard for you to figure out how much that particular chemical caused what happened to them, what you're seeing in them. And again, these were just slight increases, so it's kind of hard to figure out, is that exactly what caused it? Was it the PFOA, which was the highest PFAS chemical they saw there? Or was it one of the other PFAS chemicals that was, it's hard to tell. So we've looked at animal studies where you give them one chemical, you know exactly how much they've had, and try to figure out what effects they have. And we've seen similar effects in some of the animals that we've tested. So in animals, we see developmental effects when the maternal animals, so most of these are in rats or mice, when the rats or mice are dosed during pregnancy, before and during pregnancy and during lactation, and we see effects on their pups. We see immune effects in animals as well. At higher doses, we see liver effects, thyroid effects, reproductive effects, and at even higher doses, we start seeing tumors. So, you guys have heard about the 70 part per trillion EPA lifetime health advisory. So what is that based on? So it's based on that developmental toxicity I just talked about in those rodents. Both PFOA and PFOS have shown developmental endpoints impacted by their moms on the pups when the moms were dosed with PFOA and PFOS. So because those were developmental studies, the lifetime health advisory, and that there was the same impact by both of those chemicals, EPA decided that we should think that they're additive, that they could have, if you had both of them and were exposed to both of them, that toxicity could be additive, and that we should be looking at them together. and not exceeding with both of them combined. So that's why when we talk about PFOA and PFOS being added together to look at the toxicity, it's to protect for that developmental endpoint. So it's protective for a unborn baby against developmental effects. And because that's the most sensitive effect, it's protective for all other non-cancer and cancer effects. So how do we develop those standards? So I don't know if there's a, is this a, yeah, no, sorry. Okay, so up here we have, I'm sorry, you can't hear me. Up here we have a rat, and this was the dose that was given to the rat. And because we know that these chemicals build up in our bodies, we look at how long they last in the animal body and compared to how long they last in our bodies. Well, the animals excrete them, get rid of them a lot faster than we do. So they would get out of the animal's body. There's something called a half-life, and it's how long it takes half of the chemical to leave your body once you stop being exposed. So in animals, that half-life is days. In people, the half-life for these chemicals is years, like 2.8 to 5 years for PFOA and PFOS. So because of that, that is the biggest difference between that rodent and us. In addition, so we know that for us to get rid of it, we know that. So we also account for differences in susceptibility between the animals and us. So we add something called an uncertainty factor on top of that. So most of that difference is because of the difference in half-life, and the rest of it is making sure that we are protective of people and assuming that people may be more susceptible. So from that, we also we know that people all react differently to chemicals. So because we're using rodents, and they've been bred to be pretty similar, and we are all different. We're not inbred like most of the animals we use in toxicity studies. So we assume we're all variable, and we can react a lot differently than those animals will. So we assume additional uncertainty so that to account for that variability. So that's another tenfold from here to here. So the other thing is, remember I showed you that NHANES data where we saw everybody's got PFOA and PFOS in your blood? So everybody doesn't have PFOA and PFOS in their drinking water, but we're all exposed to it because of all the consumer products we have and other sources in our environment. So we want to make sure that we're not assuming all of it's coming from your drinking water. So because of that, EPA assumes that only 20% of your total dose every day is coming from your drinking water. So that 350 now is divided by 5 and goes down to 70. So that's the basis of that drinking water standard. Okay, so we at DHHS have also been working with DEQ and the Genesee County Health Department on these sites. So once DEQ approaches us and says, we found some elevated PFAS in this area, we want to work with you to see if there's been anybody impacted. Our biggest concern, as you heard Steve talk about, is drinking water. It's the exposure you're going to have every day drinking your water. So, you know, fish you're not going to eat every day. You're not going to eat as much fish as you drink water. So that's the one we're most concerned about. So we want to make sure, first off, that nobody's drinking the water associated with these sites. So for each of these sites, we've worked with DEQ and Genesee County Health Department to make sure that there's nobody on wells that we can tell. So with Buick City, as you heard Al Taylor say, there's no drinking water wells in the area, and we've worked with Genesee County Health Department to make sure that that's the case. For Richfield Landfill, we've also worked with Jim Ardoin. As you heard from him, the residential wells were sampled and there was non-detect for PFAS. I've worked with Jim on this site before, so I knew a little bit about it, and that was helpful.
So,
Mm-hmm.
and now, we was on the water, different cities where it's going to the river, and then landfill that was going to the river, and we dropped it from 2014 to 2015. So why aren't we getting checked for
Right.
PFAS?
They can check the blood for lead. Yeah, well, we would check for lead, but why would we check for PFAS?
Okay, so, okay.
Right. You got
Okay,
nothing.
so we don't have a PFAS registry.
Right.
We don't have a PFAS
You
registry.
go, right.
We haven't checked anybody for PFAS
Right.
except for in North Kent County. And
Here I am.
I
I
understand
live
that.
along Gilpin Creek, test.
Okay, I understand your concern, and
We'll
we'll
that's
talk about
that's
that.
a question we got written down, so
Yeah, we'll
get
get to that, okay? So, we don't want butter data. We want to prevent butter data. Yes. So, so Coldwater Road landfill, we also worked with Al Taylor's group on Coldwater Road landfill and with Jim Henry of Genesee County Health Department to make sure that the drinking water wells were tested in that area. With Goki Creek, there was a non-community water supply at Applewood Estates that was also sampled, and most of the PFAS were non-detected, and the one that was detected was very low. So the other thing I wanted to talk to you about a little bit was our Eat Safe Fish program. I think you guys have all heard about how we have PFAS getting into the surface water and the levels in the surface water. And then Stephanie also talked to you about the fish that had been collected. So DEQ looks at fish and works with us to look at fish fillets. So they may look at fish just to look at monitoring the waters, but they work with us as well so we can look at fish to see if we needed to give people advice on how much fish to eat if there's contamination in the fish. So that's what we do with our Eat Safe Fish program and our fish advisories. So we do have fish guidelines for the Flint River. As Stephanie talked to you about, that we have collected some fish from the Flint River. Most of it was in 2016. We also collected some fish in 2018, and we don't have the data back yet, but I'll show you those in a minute. So this is one section of the river, and keep in mind the fish advisory is not just for PFASs or PFOSs, which is the one that's predominantly accumulates in fish. We've been having the fish advisory. The fish advisory has been around since the 80s, and we mostly see mercury and PCBs in fish. But since we started looking for PFAS, we have seen PFOS in fish. And so for this part of the river, let me explain a little bit using this slide. See if I can get this to work. Okay, so the fish advisory talks about the different types of fish, what chemicals are causing the